Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in your international conference. And I'm honored to have been asked to share some challenges and opportunities that have come about as a result of this pandemic. So I'll be talking tonight about transformational leadership development, those challenges that have arisen, and the opportunities that are there for us to take. So with that in mind, I'd like to continue my slide presentation and talking about this coronavirus pandemic. From a health perspective, it's been terrible, but from a leadership point of view, it has accelerated changes that were inevitable in the long term. These changes have challenged leaders globally all at the same time as a result of this worldwide pandemic. Now, a lot of people have had very negative reactions to the situation because it's been so overwhelming all at one time. But what has emerged from it is either you have an organization that's producing challenging leaders, or you just have a group of group thinking followers who are basically wallowing around, not really knowing what to do next. But what has emerged is that it's no secret that companies now need leaders more than ever before. So the challenges have challenged leaders globally at the same time and with the same impact. Now, what has really become quite apparent is one challenge that has come about quickly, and this happened shortly after the pandemic broke, was that the old command control styles of leadership were absolutely not effective any longer. And it didn't matter where you are, that kind of leadership was just not effective. Okay, so a new style of leadership that had been talked about in the past and written about to quite a large extent, but had not really been embraced by the current leadership, was needed right away due to the lockdowns enforced by governments, which means that a new style of management and leadership was required because people were no longer meeting in an office. They were actually having to work from home because of the new rules and regulations. And this had an impact not only on leadership, but also the employees as well, because it meant that they were now in a strange environment, an environment where you don't have a sign on the door anymore because you're having to meet like we are now over Zoom. And for many people, this is very uncomfortable for them because it means that you have to change the way that you present yourself, the way that you communicate, and the way that you interact with the people that you lead. What was interesting is that in 2019, many companies here in the United States spent a large proportion of their budget on training. $166 billion was spent on training in 2019 here in the United States before the pandemic. But what was interesting is that so much money being spent was actually not even measured in terms of the results. And so it was in a way squandered. It was what I would call edutainment, educational entertainment, which was being provided to employees as a kind of reward, but it really didn't have any measurable results. And that explains the question, why is there such a substantial gap in leadership, qualified leaders now, after spending $166 billion? You would think that there wouldn't be a problem, but there was and is. So the challenge is, if so much money is being spent on training, why is there so little to show for it? Why is there such a substantial gap in qualified leaders worldwide? So if we have a look at that gap, 93% of managers say they need development on coaching employees. So they need to learn how to work with employees and coach them. They know how to issue directives and that sort of thing, but they don't know how to coach employees. And yet the strange thing about it is less than $4,000 a year per organization is spent on leadership development. Now, there's a difference between training and development. Development is where you get people to be able to think and act on their own and behave in such a way. Training is getting people to just do things the way you told them to do it. So there's a big difference. What is also interesting is that 77% of organizations are experiencing a very definite leadership gap. So that's more than 2/3, nearly 3/4 in fact, over 3/4 of organizations have a leadership problem right now. Okay, that's huge. And 56% of the organizations that were researched say they're not ready to meet the leadership needs in the organization because they don't have the tools with which to develop their people. So it really is quite a crisis. And the biggest gap is between the current leadership and the younger talent. Now, current leadership have the experience, the know-how, the knowledge, but they're not always IT savvy. In other words, they don't like Zoom. They don't like using computers. They have a resistance towards that to a large degree. Whereas the new younger talent, that's where they live. They live in the ether. They love to text. They love to communicate that way. Not so with the older leadership. So for organizations to succeed in this new environment, this gap has to be closed. It has to be bridged somehow. It was important before, but now that we've experienced this COVID where we're having to live apart, work apart, it's now become vital. So let's have another look at this. Let's look at this problem with leadership development. As we know, and many of us have experienced this, in a world where budgets are now very tight and people are really watching closely and carefully how they spend their money, at the same time, they're finding that competition is still there and it's still fierce. And what's important now is return on investment is so much more important than it's ever been. You can't squander money. So the common practice of companies today is to bring what used to be of the yesterday before the COVID was to bring in a trainer or a coach for 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3 days of training with their team. But here's the problem. During those few hours of meeting, there's not much discussion or participation, just lectures on the basic principles of leadership and ideas about leadership. And what happens, we know, and it may even happen during my talk right now, after about 20 minutes, people's attention span starts to wander. So what happens in these day or 2 day or 3 day sessions, events, people start to suffer from overload, information overload. And that kicks in for most employees. And little, if any, information is actually remembered or acted upon. And what's interesting is that according to information released by the University of Waterloo, people forget about 98% of what they learn just after 1 month. So you can imagine, you put people into expensive 3-day events for training, and then after a month, they've forgotten most of it and can only remember 2%. And of that 2%, how much of that 2% would ever get actually applied, and then the application be measured for the efficacy of that training? Well, what research has shown is that 90% of CEOs, that's chief executive officers, believe that current development initiatives have that they believe that they have no clear impact on their businesses. Only 10% believe that they do. And yet they're quite happy to spend $166 billion on this sort of training. Doesn't really make sense. Why spend all that money for maybe a 1 to 2% boost in knowledge and maybe that amount of application? Is it really worth it? I would say maybe not. Maybe that can't be done in the future. People, if they really are in a tight spot, which many companies are due to this pandemic, They have to spend their money really wisely. So more and more unqualified employees are being thrust into leadership roles with prior understanding of what successful leaders need. And what is even more alarming is that an incredibly small number of leaders believe that the leadership training they have received or that they are giving at the moment is even relevant. Most of it is irrelevant. So there's the challenge that leaders and managers are crying out for more development, and the opportunity is, if we can give them something relevant, they will take it up in a heartbeat. They will jump on it. And that's important to remember. So there's no time to waste. Whether we want to admit it or not, the workforce that we are facing now, that we're seeing now, is aggressively changing every day. 75% of the workforce will be millennials, and the leadership, when I say workforce, it's not just workforce, leadership will be millennials by the year 2025. In fact, it's almost at 55% right now. So that means that this new group of leaders, they have different needs and aspirations to the leaders of the past. So the leadership that we have now, and that's been in place for years, is soon going to be gone. There'll be a new group of leaders to take over. But the question here and the challenge here is, are those leaders prepared? And if not now, when will they be prepared? It's really time to act now and to prepare the leaders of the future now. Now, because of the pandemic, many people have said, well, it's kind of difficult to spend money on developing leaders. Why don't we wait until things get better? Well, my answer to that is a bad decision is better than no decision at all. Sitting on your hands and waiting is not going to achieve anything. All it will do is get you deeper into a problem. So even better is to start now and start developing your up-and-coming leaders in your organization. But it's the kind of leadership development that you need that has to be really looked at. The old transactional leadership style, which is, I'll show you what to do, I'll tell you what to do, you go and do it, and you'll become successful. You'll get the results. That kind of leadership is not as effective as is required now, because underlying all of that is, we say that your habits of thought dictate your habits of action. So if you're used to behaving in a certain way and you're just told to behave in a different way and shown to act in a different way, that's not necessarily going to get you to do it for very long, or certainly not in the long term. And the reason is because your thinking hasn't changed. Therefore, your action and behavior is unlikely to change. So if you want to have leaders develop, you have to start working with them as individuals and working on their habit of thought, working on the way they think, so that you can help them act and behave in a way that will give you the results you would like to experience. What is also interesting is that in research, 84% of organizations have already anticipated a shortfall of leaders in the next 5 years. So in other words, the old guard is not being effectively replaced by the new leaders. And that is a problem, but it's also a wonderful opportunity if you can develop those leaders in the right way. So companies need leaders, leaders need development. What was interesting is Deloitte's conducted a survey that included 2,500 business and HR leaders in 94 countries. That is very extensive research. And what they found was, well, what they did was they asked these business leaders around the world to decide which of 12 different global trends are the most important and require the highest urgency. Out of the 12 trends, 4 that were selected all had to do with filling the leadership gap that has become so evident in companies around the world. And let me show you some of the findings that they found here. If you look at the top, the number 1 issue was leadership. It was the most urgent and important. 86% of the companies identified that leadership development was the most important and urgent needed. But if that's the case, why aren't they dealing with this the correct way? If companies know they need leaders and leaders must be developed to embrace the always changing needs of the 21st century businesses, and now the changes that have been accelerated through this pandemic, why aren't they developing their leaders to fulfill these roles? It's a good challenge and it's a good question. Well, let's look at the realities of this. The facts are that companies are having a hard time preparing for the future. And this really comes about for the traditional leaders. These are what we call baby boomers. They're retiring every day. New leaders are having to step up and take on the roles that they might not be adequately prepared to fill. And the reason for that is that they've been trained, not developed. You know, you can show someone how to do something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to do it. They may want to do it a different way. They may not even want to do it. Okay, so these are questions that have to be analyzed and looked at. Are we putting the right people in the right places? Are we developing in the right way? So what we found, and this is research found, is that those that are required to step up and not being trained adequately to do so. And this is misusing money and wasting precious time for companies all over the world in every industry. So this can come about as a lack of training, a lack of experience, a lack of goals, a lack of desire, or a lack of personal development. And what we're seeing is that turnover rates are rising, costs are skyrocketing, and in the process of people coming in and out of businesses rapidly, it does affect morale. Morale decreases. In a company that's stable and people are happy and are being recognized and can grow, those companies are doing exceptionally well. So ultimately, companies will be forced to close their doors and thousands of people will be out of jobs if they do not elect to change and get involved in transformational development. Transactional development is really for showing people how to do a job, but it's not teaching them how to be a leader. So this massive gap stands between where leaders should be and where they currently stand. And I don't want to alarm people, but if this gap is not filled on a personal level, companies will suffer the consequences. So we're looking at a mental shift, because when we're talking about transformational change, we're talking about changing the way people think to change the way they act and behave to get the results that they want. So what we're looking at is development over pep rallies. Pep rallies are really where people get involved in fun kind of activities where they do fun things, and it's called, leadership development. A lot of the information is good and a lot of the exercises are enjoyable, but what are the results? They usually are very, what I would call edutainment, the educational entertainment. They don't really come out and measure the results. They don't have a fixed goal in mind. It's just there to stimulate the thoughts of the people that they're dealing with. Now, that may be a very harsh way of putting it, but think of a lot of the coaching and development events that go on, the motivational speeches and talks, where thousands of people go to a stadium and listen to a very motivational speaker. What the speaker says is usually great. They're really good at putting the message across. But those people walk out the stadium much the same as they'd walk out after a football game. It was entertaining at the time, but they remember very little of it. What they do remember is soon forgotten. Definitely, if they can remember 2% of it after a month, it's a lot. So companies have to move away from quick fixes, which cost a lot of money, and as I said, are entertainment, to true leadership development, which takes time and involves a process. If you think about how you learned to do anything, it was over a period of time with a lot of repetition, spaced repetition. If you learned to drive a motor vehicle, you didn't just get into the vehicle and become a very effective driver straight away. You have to practice at it. and practice at it until it became automatic action. You didn't have to think. Most of you don't have to think if you have to drive somewhere. You just get in the car and you drive there. Especially nowadays when you have GPS that can take you where you're going, you just follow the instructions. You're thinking about other things rather than driving. So that's what we're talking about, is where people are developed to the point where they don't have to think too much about what they're doing because it's so drummed into them. It's become so intuitive that they are acting out of automatic cues, really. If you think about how complicated it is to drive a motor car, fly an airplane or whatever, if you practice that and learn it and you internalize the method of how to do that, it becomes automatic action, especially in times of crisis. So that's what the ultimate goal is, to get people to change the way they're thinking through true leadership development. And the difference is that the key to leadership today is influence, not authority. When I was talking about command and control earlier on, that was referring back to just do it, do what I say, don't argue with me. That's the command control. It's authority. I'm a manager, I'm a leader, you have to do what I say. When you're working from home, how could you possibly do that if your workers are not even within arm's reach? They may be miles away, hundreds of miles away, or in this case, I'm talking to you from Texas, and most of you are at least 2,000 miles away from me. So I have no authority over you. But if I could influence you, if I had to lead you, but I'd have to learn how to do that. So leaders gain influence through their qualities, not their position. Leaders are always constant learners. Leaders have to keep up with what's going on, and leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. So if you're not constantly being developed, if you're not constantly learning and keeping up pace with what the changing environment, you're going to fall behind and you're not going to be an effective leader. Leaders also today have to be able to inspire the people who report to them to achieve maximum potential. So in other words, the greatest leader is not necessarily the one that does the greatest things and is the expert and the best at whatever it's going on. The leader is the one who gets things done through other people. And as Ronald Reagan said, he is the one that gets people to do the greatest things. Okay, so what is leadership today? In the past, where position or title was the main requisite for becoming a prerequisite for becoming a leader, that's simply not the case today. Behavioral change through consistent development is the order of the day. And in a study done by Gallup, employees that rated their management low on approachability, that's in the graph there you'll see is 1 and 2, only had a combined engagement level of 5%. Now, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Gallup research in terms of engagement, but there are 3 categories. There's engaged, which means that people are willing to go the extra mile to get a result. Then there's not engaged, which is people that just go to work 8 to 5 to get a salary. They'll do what's required and no more. Then there are people who are disengaged. They're people that really they're not keen on well, the engaged people go to work 8 to 5 and do what's required, no more. The disengaged are those people that go to work 8 to 5, but do as little as possible for as much money as possible. They're not really concerned about the outcome of the business or organization. They're more about just getting what they can for themselves. And then they're actively disengaged, are talking down the business. They're complaining all the time. They're complaining about the management, the leadership. They're complaining about the company. They're complaining about everything. Now, if you have a look at that graph there, where they have managers who do not get involved in developing personal and business goals, and it's interesting that they say personal and business goals, that the level of disengagement is huge. I mean, you're looking at 65 and 65% are actively disengaged in those companies. Between 47 and 65% are actively disengaged. In other words, they are very unhappy and unhappy with the organization. Between 33 and 50% are not engaged at all. They just go there to work, get the money and go home, do as little as possible for as much as possible. So what the study is really saying is that if a manager or leader helps employees set performance goals for them personally, as well as professionally, and can link the two, especially if they can say, well, if you can achieve these personal goals, this will be able to help you achieve this other personal goal that you've identified. And they get them to identify a personal goal in the context of the business goal. Those people are, the 94% are either engaged or when they say not engaged, in other words, the 40%, sorry, 54% will be engaged. They are going the extra mile. That's over half of the business. The employees are really doing the best they possibly can. There's going to be 40% who go to work, get the money and go home. But if you look at the difference between managers that do work with their employees, that's the number 5, and then those that are not doing it at all, you can see that the difference is enormous. And I think that this is starting to become very apparent in the COVID-19 pandemic era, where managers don't know how to lead their people that are working from home, and the people at home are not sure how to work from home and be productive. And so that's creating a big problem, but it's also creating a big opportunity. Think about what business leaders need and want. It's pretty easy to identify this. They want increased productivity and engagement from people working at home. They need to have enhanced communication because they're having to communicate through emails, maybe over Zoom, things like that. They need to have their employees have an increased focus on priorities. They need these people to be retained. So they want to keep the good key personnel, but to do that, they have to develop them. They need improved teamwork, and they need to manage the productivity of others. So those results are pretty standard, and looking across the board, across the globe, those would be things that managers and leaders are mainly interested in. Traditionally, what resources were available in the past and to a large extent still are available is things like seminars and retreats, online videos and online courses, motivational speakers, books and articles, social media, and continuing education. Now, when we talk about online courses, these are online courses that you do just by yourself. There's no real input from anybody else. These have good information quite often, but as we've seen, measurable results from these resources are very limited. And here's why. The traditional approaches, as I said, have good information, but the lie is that knowledge is power. That's not true. Knowledge is just information and only becomes powerful when applied to get measurable results. So often these resources are exciting. If you have a look at here, the interest and the retention over time, you'll see that there's little long-term retention, and that's due because there's little follow-up, limited follow-up, very little application, no measurable results usually, and what then happens is over a period of time they forget. Like I said, after a short period of time, even maybe even a month or two, you're down to 2% retention and very little measurement on return on investment. That's the traditional approach. Well, what do we need now? What we need now, a new approach. And this approach is different. There's the old approach. The new approach is to have information shared over a period of time, and it's being applied at the time of learning. So it involves interactive workshops, on-the-job application. It requires spaced repetition, the same way as you learned how to drive a motor vehicle or ride a bicycle or anything that now has become a habit that you can do without thinking. That's the kind of approach that is required, and it needs to be linked to measurable results. Okay, so instead of the traditional approach, which is let me tell you what to do, you do it now, and you'll get results, that's all theory. Unless people change the way they habitually think, as I mentioned, they're very unlikely to change the way they act and behave. So that's being observed now very clearly with employees having to work from home, which is a totally different environment from working at the office. So before they can become effective and productive at working at home, they have to change the way they think and act. So employees need to change that as well. And a lot of people have misunderstood things. They've always thought of management and leadership training and as we only deal with those people. But what is happening now is in businesses, you need to have leaders and managers all the way through the organization. And what I mean by that is you need to not only embrace transformational development of leaders and managers, but also employees. Because you need people, especially if they're working from home. Think about it. If they're working from home, they have to learn to manage and motivate themselves. They have to learn how to lead themselves before they can become effective and engaged employees. How much more could be achieved if everybody was on the same page and using the same process of transformational development? It would be enormous. So leaders throughout the entire organization are needed now more than ever. Companies who have embraced this factual truth will succeed, and those who have not will fail. And looking at these up and coming leaders, the younger leaders that are going to take over the leadership role in more significant numbers than ever before, what are they looking for? Well, 72% of millennials and Gen Z want to start their own business. Only 16% would prefer a corporate environment. That's because of the corporate environment being what it is now. But if that environment can change, those numbers would change, and they would rather stay within an organization that is embracing their needs, because then they don't have to take the risk of going out and being an entrepreneur on their own. And the risk is huge, and a lot of them can fail, and a lot do. But for that environment to be correct, they must have an opportunity for growth, and they have an entrepreneurial spirit, which means they like to be leaders and managers of themselves, but they need to be directed in that way. So these people are willing and able, and I've had the privilege of working with a number of these millennials and Gen Zs, and I'm astonished at when you have the right approach, the productivity of these people is unbelievable. But they want more responsibility, they want to grow, they have an entrepreneurial spirit, they want to lead themselves, they want to make a difference through their work and have meaning and measurement. They enjoy working remotely. That's a big thing now. If you think about it, so many of the people outside of the millennial and Gen Z era, a lot of them struggle with working from home. But even those that are millennials and are working at home, some of them have young families, and working from home needs a whole different discipline than working in the office, because a lot of these people are having to work at the office, at least at home, and educate their children at the same time because of the lockdown and schools being closed. But they have to learn, they need help in becoming more productive in this new environment, but they are willing to learn. They're very willing and open to learn. So what can companies do? So leadership and development, as I mentioned before, really begins with learning how to lead and manage oneself. And as I mentioned, too often we think of leadership development as only for those who have reports or answering to them. And that's old traditional thinking. And it's more aligned with the industrial command and control thinking. A successful company of the future is one where every employer is a leader by first being a leader of themselves and then growing into becoming a leader of others. So at the end of the day, companies have three choices. They can either grow and adapt through the development of their employees into leaders, or they can wait to make a change and fall deeply behind. That's sitting on their hands and waiting for events to change before they start to change themselves. Or they can decide not to change and eventually shut their doors because they just won't be in the right marketplace. So I was told I wasn't to really go more than 20 minutes, and I think I've overshot that. So if you would like a white paper that covers this presentation and more, you can email me at that email address, and I'd be very happy to send you one. And I'll send that, by email to anyone who is willing to, who would like to learn more about that. And with that, I'll hand it over back to you, Fatima.